Good evening, one and all. Thank you so much for joining us for our panel discussion this evening, De-Colonizing Shakespeare, or as one of our panelists will share tonight, a program that perhaps could be called Uncolonizing Shakespeare. My name is David Stradley, producing artistic director of Delaware Shakespeare. I'll be joined by our three panelists in just a few moments. We'd like to thank the Delaware Division of the Arts for its year-round support, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts and Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation for some COVID relief funding. Tonight's program is a Pay What You Decide event. When the event is done, you'll be sent an email with a link inviting you to pay what you decide the program is worth to you, or whatever you are able to pay at this moment. If you are new to Delaware Shakespeare, I invite you to explore our website at delshakes.org and learn more about us. As the weather is warming up, we'll begin offering outdoors, socially distanced events. On Sunday, April 25th, we'll be inviting people to come to 7th and West Streets Park to drop off 30-word poems for our public poetry project right outside your window. And on May 20th through 23rd, we'll be having a collaborative performance with Opera Delaware called Shakespeare in Song. Most of us are Zooming tonight from the traditional lands of the Lenape people. We acknowledge them as the original stewards of this land. Del Shakes aims to bring our community together to explore our shared humanity. We invite you to consider how your humanity is interlinked with that of the Lenape people, or the indigenous people of whatever land you are watching from tonight. I'm grateful to Tara Moses and her firm Groundwater Arts for supplying this following Zoom land acknowledgement. Zoom, the platform that we are using today and many days, is headquartered in what is now called San Jose, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Temian peoples. We acknowledge the lands Zoom resides on because this conversation we are having tonight on a digital platform does not exist in an ether, in an imaginary void, but is made possible because of the physical land and the indigenous people who steward it. So with that, I'm going to welcome in now our incredible panelists tonight, Nicolette Bethel, Tara Moses, and Deshik Vansadia. So come on in, panelists. Very excited to have all these wonderful people with us tonight. They all have some illustrious bios, but I'm just going to share a few highlights before we get started with our discussion tonight. So just in alphabetical order, Nicolette Bethel was born and raised in Nassau, Bahamas, where she currently resides. She has lived, studied, and worked in the UK and Canada, and served as Director of Culture for the Bahamas for 5 years. She is the founder and president of the Shakespeare in Paradise Theater Festival and of Ring Play Productions Theater Company. She's got a Shakespeare in Paradise t-shirt on tonight. She's a playwright, poet, fiction writer, and anthropologist. Nicolette holds a BA with honors in literature and French from the University of Toronto, and a master's in philosophy and a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge. She is currently assistant professor of sociology at the College of the Bahamas, and serves as head of the Department of Psychology, Sociology, and Social Work. Thanks for being with us tonight, Nicolette.
Thank you, thank you. I just want to update. I've been promoted to associate professor.
Congratulations.
And chair of social sciences, so things are looking up.
Next, we have Tara Moses. Tara Moses is a citizen of Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, Muskogee, director, multi-award-winning playwright, and the co-artistic director in residence at Red Eagle Soaring, producing artistic director of Teletulsa, co-founder and senior producer of Binge, and co-founder of Groundwater Arts, which is a consulting firm. So if we have any arts executive directors out there, you can hit up Tara and her firm for help after you hear what she has to say tonight. As a director, Tara's work has been seen all over the place: New York, Tulsa, Washington, D.C., Bethesda, Maryland, Oklahoma City, many other locations. As a playwright, she has a multitude of completed works. For the purpose of tonight's panel, I want to point out her adaptation of classics, which include Hamlet, El Principe de Denmark, Don Juan, and Ao, which is based on Trojan women. She is currently commissioned by Oregon Shakespeare Festival and Jiva Theater, among many others. and Tara is currently based on the Muskogee Creek Reservation, or what is colonial known as Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thanks for making the time to be here, Tara.
Yeah, Mado, thank you. And he's Jay, everyone. It's Congo. Glad to be here.
And then last but earliest, we have Deshik Vansadia, who is coming to us from India at 4:30 your time. Is that right? Yeah. So Desh is often called the Shakespearean actor in his native India, and he has been referred to as one of the most prominent and dedicated practitioners of Shakespearean works in his country. Now living in Mumbai, Desh trained as an actor in the United States at the Stellar Adler Acting Studio in Los Angeles and with Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts. After independently producing several Shakespeare productions in India, he has recently founded the Shakespeare Company of India. His acting credits in Shakespeare include Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Cymbeline. His directing credits include The Taming of the Shrew, Measure for Measure, Shakespeare's Lovers, and Shakespeare Who. He teaches at the Drama School of Mumbai, and with the Shakespeare Company of India also works and does Shakespeare education with several schools all over India. Thanks for being here, Desh.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So this panel tonight, or this morning, if you are in India, should last about 75 to 90 minutes. We're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves for about 60 to 75 minutes. And then audience, as you are listening, please feel free to type in questions using the Q&A feature on this webinar. We'll start taking those questions around the 60 to 75-minute mark. We'll try to get as many as we can, but we have no shortage of things to talk about this evening. Also, if you're having any technical issues, you can also mention that in the Q&A, and we will try to help you out. So, De-Colonizing Shakespeare. Through its recently developed anti-racism plan, Delaware Shakespeare is committed to interrogating the works of William Shakespeare in order to identify the ways that Shakespeare has done harm and identifies ways to reduce that harm moving forward. Now, as we were developing our anti-racism plan, people would sometimes ask, well, what do you mean? How has Shakespeare done harm? What are you talking about? And one way to answer that question is to ask, well, how did Shakespeare's words arrive where you are? And what was the impact of those words arriving there? Unless you live in England, the chance is pretty high the answer to that question is colonialism. And as we all know, colonialism did not have great impact on Indigenous people when it arrived. So when we talk about Shakespeare, at times we're talking about two things. We're talking about Shakespeare the writer and Shakespeare the system. Now, Shakespeare the writer, we think, is a guy who lived for 50 years or so in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, wrote about 38 plays. Then we've got Shakespeare the system, this whole worldview that has set Shakespeare up as the standard of kind of great theater writing. And that system is tied directly into colonialism. Foreign powers setting up their way of doing things as the only way of doing things. Our panelists tonight each come from a different land. Those lands each have a different, though related, history of how Shakespeare arrived. So we're going to hear about those histories and then hear how these artists are working on these plays now and trying to do so in a way that is not perpetuating colonial harm. So the first question is just that very real question of how did Shakespeare's words arrive in your native land? And then how were those words utilized by that colonializing force when they arrived in your land? And I think since Delaware Shakespeare is in what is colonially known as the United States of America, I think we're going to start with Tara, if you don't mind, Tara, and share a little bit about how these words arrived in this land.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can speak to specifically how Shakespeare's words arrived to my peoples and in the indigenous peoples of this specific land. So through the boarding school system, anyone tuning in from Canada, the residential school system. So basically the system of stealing Native children and then abusing them, murdering them if needed, to actually like kill the Indian and quote unquote save the man. Anyway, Shakespeare was a tool of the colonization of Indigenous children. And so when it came to like what is appropriate like literature, it was using Shakespeare's plays, and using those plays in that heightened language to quite literally beat the Indigenous languages out of these young people. Anyway, again, like as a tool of genocide, and like forced assimilation. Anyway, and so that is the relationship that my people have to Shakespeare is that it's been very much a tool of this kind of oppression. It's never been anything other than that. And then in my own experience growing up, it was also that same tool of like ongoing cultural genocide and assimilation of being forced to learn this heightened language. And what's really interesting, since we've talked since, I was asking my dad about this because I was thinking about for my own self, I got put into like speech therapy classes in elementary school. I didn't remember why. But it was a thing. Anyway, and I was asking him about it, and he was like, oh, it's because you were speaking Muskogee and English at the same time, and they wanted you to only speak English. And I was like, interesting, interesting. But I was asking him, I was like, do you like have any of those like papers or materials? Anyway, so he was going through his stuff. And sure enough, the some of the pieces of like text they gave me to like beat out my Muskogee language were like Shakespearean sonnets, which I thought that was really interesting. So whenever I say like that is the current relationship, like it truly is, and it's never stopped. And so it's always been that tool of ongoing colonialism.
Nicolette, Desh, how does that track with how the words came to your countries?
Pretty similar. So first, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. I was sharing with the panel before we started. It's a difficult land acknowledgement because basically the people who were here first are not here anymore. They're gone. But the Bahamas is the land that was known, inhabited by the Taino people who call themselves the Lukukairi, the people of the islands. But I was really excited, Tara, to find out that you are of the Seminole people, because when there was a period of time, and I don't know what was happening in Florida, but there were Seminole people who came to the Bahamas and they settled in one of our islands. And they have descendants who are still there, who were descended. They're kind of a maroon community with Africans and Seminole people who married and created a community. So that is still there, but they were not the original inhabitants. They settled later around the same time as the others. So Shakespeare was used to, well, as I was saying, the whole of the Caribbean region was basically depopulated. An actual genocide occurred, and then it was repopulated. Plantations were created, and it was repopulated by people who were brought forcibly from other places. First from Africa, and then after the Africans were emancipated, from India, China, and other places. And Shakespeare was a tool of colonization, but also a tool of distinguishing the savage from the civilized. Shakespeare was the language of the civilized. And so we were, or I should say, our people were exposed to Shakespeare with no idea that we could actually master or do or really understand Shakespeare. It was kind of like, this is what you cannot be. This is why we have the right to subjugate you, because we created this and you did not. So that's the way in which Shakespeare was used. And again, it's like David said, the system versus the man. But that's how Shakespeare's words, I guess, got here. There could be other ways, because as I also shared, the Bahamas was settled maybe only 30 years after Jamestown. And so the people who settled in the Bahamas would have been speaking very much the language that Shakespeare was speaking, and might have done his plays, might have brought his plays. But what we know is Shakespeare as a tool of oppression.
And then Desh, how does that compare to how Shakespeare arrived in India?
there are similar elements, and then there in some ways is quite different. So of course, English and Shakespeare came with when the East India Company came to uh, India. Well, basically, there were some came and then they slowly established a company called East India Company, and then eventually just whole government went under the Queen Victoria. But it was not subtle. I mean, what the outside of the story is that, the colonialism for India is bloody. People were shot, killed, murdered, hung up naked in the street. So there was no propaganda way of subtly changing things, where it was right away, we're taking over. And if you stand against us, we're going to kill you. So the divide was right away. And the color card was played, of course, to the strong, uh, at a really, really strong level. That, but there were some, there were some Indians who thought maybe it's better to work with them. So what happened is that, there's a racial discrimination. So it's like you're dark-skinned people, you're beneath us, you belong to the dirt, and we are running the country. But some Indians who managed to go to universities and educate themselves and start to speak English fluently, and if they could recite Shakespeare well, that was really the sign that now they could. They still wouldn't brush shoulders with the English authority. They're still not going to be treated equally, but they'll be like, "You can be my assistant. I'm not gonna treat you how I treat the other Indians." So that's where. So India didn't have. I don't think the Shakespeare the man ever was present in those times. It was only Shakespeare, the system. But I don't know how Shakespeare was. I don't think I know enough to make a statement about how Shakespeare was specifically used. But I know that the color of the skin was one of the biggest tools or weapons in bringing the racial discrimination. And with that color, English language came handy. And with English language, Shakespeare came, because even, after freedom, I grew up like 60 years after India's freedom. And growing up, and I grew up in a small town, but still, like, to be able to speak English was seen as a real, what's the right word? It was very desired. It was seen as the sign of an upper class family, and if children spoke English, they were always admired a lot and thought of very highly. So, and on top of that, if you could say one or two things about Shakespeare, you are like, wow, you're really up there. You're not just able to speak English, but you're like British if you can talk some Shakespeare then. So yeah.
And panelists, as we talked about before, if anytime you want to jump in and kind of jump off something one of you say, please feel free to do that. But I want to go from the kind of historic sketch that you've each given us to how that's living out today in each of your lands. Just as far as how, and I'm realizing there is no monolithic response to this question, but how in the indigenous, or in Nicolette's case, not the indigenous, but then the other people who are in this land, how do they perceive Shakespeare now? And I think, Desh, I want to start with you on this, because I know you've shared that it's actually, for you, it's been very personal as far as the work you are doing and how Shakespeare is seen now and how that makes people look at you. So do you want to share a little bit about how Shakespeare is seen in India now by the indigenous people?
But you're right. So for the majority, they hate him because he's a white dude from the same land that oppressed us for 200 years and killed and stolen everything. So they all hate him. There's a very small community with the English, as the main, like, literature, the MA with English or MFA with literature, and these are the people who studied English and Shakespeare, and so they love him. Otherwise, every time I face this question on everyday basis, why Shakespeare? Why not an Indian writer? Why not take something from our scriptures, our writers? India has this rich ancient history. I mean, we have so much literature, and we also have tons of languages. Every state has a different language, so there's so much. There's so much. So why Shakespeare? But for them, because they don't see him as a writer, they see him as an English, not an English writer, but a British white writer. So that's how they mostly see it.
And Tara, how about you? I know as we were talking earlier, you said there's 570 plus federally recognized tribes in the U.S. So there's really not going to be one opinion on how Shakespeare is seen. But what is your thought on how Indigenous people in the U.S. right now are in their relation to Shakespeare?
I mean, very similar. This is like, he is just another like tool of colonization. And it's, the more I've been like thinking about like this question, and like also just like turning to like my network of other like Indigenous colleagues and such, no one is ever like talking about their adaptation of Shakespeare. No one's ever talking about they're going to direct something that's by Shakespeare. It's always about it's always about contemporary like living Native playwrights, like the foundational Native playwrights of decades ago, and really much centered on telling our very specific stories. And like Shakespeare's just not that. I mean, in addition to like his history of like genocide, with lots of people. Anyway, we're in this point specifically in the theater right now where there are theaters across the country that are producing Native playwrights for the very first time in their histories. And for the very first time since theater became a thing in the United States. Anyway, and so it's very much this just like, it's not even a question. It's like, are we going to continue to uphold this colonial system and tell these stories with these themes that are not universal? Y'all at home listening, they ain't universal. Anyway, that are deeply, deeply colonial and uphold white supremacy. Even if you have Black and brown actors and Indigenous actors saying those words, it doesn't change the fact that these themes are not universal and they uphold white supremacy and colonization. Don't worry, we'll get there later. Anyway, so why do that when we can tell our stories in community, uplift, like living Native artists, and like continue to like empower our youth to continue to write, be introduced into the theater. And so it's a really pivotal moment right now for like Native artists, because it's like finally starting to break into the quote unquote American canon. So ironic. Anyway, and so like Shakespeare's irrelevant. He has no purpose. There is no understanding. There is no crossover. So like, why do it? Anyway, so that's been a lot of the conversations that we've been having internally. And also like additionally, like, again, like his works are still used to kill the Indian and save the man. To this day, like today, like there's a reason why you go to bookstores or into like libraries and you see hundreds and hundreds of copies of Shakespeare's plays, but not a single play by a Native playwright or even a foundational Native playwright. It's very intentional anyway. And so like trying to think of how I would describe like my specific communities and my specific like relationship to Shakespeare, there is none. There is no relationship. He did not write plays for my people in mind. He did not write them for us to do. The system itself also was built intentionally not for us. So like, why would we try to bring him in when we were never meant to be there in the first place? Has sort of been the general consensus lately. That's how it is over here.
And then Nicolette, I know you wrote to me that there, and you mentioned it yourself. There are no indigenous people of Bahamas. We're all descendants of the slaveholding structures that replaced them.
Mhm.
But of those, I don't know. Is there even a difference between the? Well, I'll just leave it. How do you see the people in Bahamas seeing Shakespeare now?
So, okay. Apologies for the dogs. I don't know. They just decided they have to bark.
Never have to apologize for dogs. My wife is now much more probably listening upstairs because there's dogs.
So, there's our response, or the response in the Bahamas is similar in many ways to the response that Tara was talking about. But there's also a real element of fear and a real element of, I don't know how to describe it, of not being good enough for Shakespeare, because that is the message that was given to us. So when we started Shakespeare in Paradise, we set out to, I'll talk about why we did it later, but one of the cornerstones of the festival is a series of matinees, because we still have people who are studying Shakespeare in school. It's still part of the canon. It is not a necessary part of the canon. Everybody does not study Shakespeare. And in fact, most teachers in the system, unless they're in the private school system, don't touch Shakespeare with a 10-foot pole because it's too hard, okay? And it's, and there is this deeply ingrained sense that you descendants of enslaved African people cannot understand Shakespeare, cannot get this great cultural product. And we've internalized that. So I would say that for us in the Bahamas, possibly there is the sense of irrelevance, but there's also the sense of fear. And we're just not there. We're not good enough. In the rest of the Caribbean, where they have had different relationships, different colonial relationships from the Bahamas, because they had full-fledged plantation systems. And when people tried to set up a plantation system in the Bahamas, it did not last. We have a different model of slavery in our history. But those people who come out of a plantation system are very much like what Tara is saying. Our colleagues in the rest of the Caribbean are like, what are y'all doing? Putting on Shakespeare in Paris. What are you thinking, right? This is not for us. Why aren't you doing Walcott? Why aren't you doing Brathwaite? Same thing as Tara.
Now I can imagine. Go ahead, Tara.
Is that, yes, that's also the part two for us also, of like, we're not good enough for Shakespeare. We're not refined enough. We're not civilized enough.
Civilized is important.
Oh, that's a thing. That's a thing. Anyway, and that also contributes to to that sentiment of why do it. Yeah. Ooh. Yep. Right there.
So I can imagine.
I have a different issue.
Yeah.
Because here people see Shakespeare as an extremely stylized piece of theater. So not so much that, I mean, of course people do say, oh, Shakespeare, I don't know about that. Oh, but the difficulty is not so high. Like once we get to the rehearsals or even the reading, the real difficulty that I face is that they think that they need a British accent to say it. Or if not British, that they would have something bizarre, a mix of Italian and British, something that is very, very stylized, like a period piece, and they don't act like themselves. And right away, they start speaking with an accent, which is mostly British. I mean, trying to be British accent, because they think that that's how it needs to be done. That they right away start mimicking what their idea of how British did Shakespeare.
Yeah, so that, I think that takes us right to where I'd love to go next is the practices you each have now with Shakespeare. Because even though in this first 20 minutes, we've heard of this very complicated, very painful history of Shakespeare in your countries, you each are artists that have a history yourself of of doing Shakespeare and working on Shakespeare. And so I'd love to get into some of that now. And Nicolette, I think I'd love to start with you. And if you could tell us a little bit about Shakespeare in Paradise. And I think specifically, one of the things that I think I just picked up from you at the last Shakespeare Theater Association conference that we met at was that you all very specifically chose both Shakespeare and Paradise as part of the company's name because of what you wanted to do. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's intentional. It's totally intentional. And both Shakespeare and Paradise are highly contested ideas. So we in the Bahamas live in a place where one of my colleagues has written, there are no people, right? There's just sea and sand and beautiful experiences for tourists to consume, but there aren't any people. There are servanty kind of beings, but they're not people. So that's the other side of it. So in addition to not being good enough for Shakespeare, we are also not real people. We don't inhabit a real land. And there are conversations that you see, and thank heaven for social media, because we actually see how prevalent these ideas are and we can start to challenge them. But there are ideas like, I'm sure you guys have heard it, where you say, you know, real people don't do that, actors do that. So we have the same kind of thing on We Turned Around in the Bahamas. So real people are tourists, but the rest of us are not real people. So that's the Paradise myth. And then we have the civilized, the myth of civilization, the Shakespeare, the civilized myth. And what we wanted to do with Shakespeare in Paradise was totally intentional, because the only way that the Bahamas gets revenue is through tourism. But all of our tourism is built around an empty space. It's built around a beach or a casino, right? A resort where people pay to be separated from the community. But we wanted to build, inspired by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, my husband and I wanted to build a reason for people to come to the Bahamas as tourists, but the way that we travel as tourists. We go to New York, we go to London, we go to Oregon, we go to see plays. So we thought, why don't we set it up so that people want to come and see plays in the Bahamas? So Paradise is part of the selling idea, because that's what people think of. And Shakespeare is also, it's a marketing thing. It's not just a marketing thing though. I mean, the name is the marketing, but what we're trying to do is I think it's really important, given the harm that Shakespeare has done, the Shakespeare, the system. I think it's really important for those of us who have been harmed by that system to master it. You know, there was a period of time when Wynton Marsalis did a tour. This was many years ago, because, you know, back then playing jazz was not at the pinnacle of musicianship, playing classical music. So Wynton Marsalis said, fine, I'm going to show you all I could play classical music. And for like 2 or 3 years, he went around and he performed with classical orchestras all around the world. And then he was like, fine, I finished with that. Now I'm going back to my music, my jazz. I think it's important for us to show ourselves and to stretch ourselves, to embody and to master this thing that we have been told we can't do. And then there's the side issue that, you know, Shakespeare's stories, they may not be universal, but they relate to us because we come from that same, how can I put it? We are part of that system that took over and created the genocide of the Americas. We're part of that. We came with that. We didn't come intentionally, but we are part of that. And so the themes that Shakespeare addresses are, many of them, not all of them, are actually part of our experience. They can be explained, they can be recognized. And it's really interesting that Shakespeare was one of the things that enslaved Africans throughout the Caribbean performed when they could. And I find that interesting. I don't know enough about it, but did it in a sense of resistance, taking Shakespeare's plays and turning them around as a tool of empowerment. That's what we're trying to do in Shakespeare in Paradise.
Thanks, Nicolette. So Tara, maybe if we go to you on this question, because I know that you were sharing with me that Shakespeare was actually your entree into theater. And if you want to kind of share that journey, and then how that, what the connective tissue there is between that and now the work you do in adapting classics is.
Yeah, so began my journey into the theater at the ripe young age of 8 years old. And at that time, there were not native plays being produced where I lived. I mean, and also full disclosure, I didn't know that native plays existed until my next to last year of undergrad. So didn't even know. Anyway, and well, because of who I was as a young native girl, um living in a predominantly white community, um especially after like moving from Seminole Nation into that community made it even worse, where like there were just not opportunities for me to be cast in the quote unquote contemporary plays that were being produced because they just couldn't see me in any other role besides the maid. Anyway, so what I found with Shakespeare is that folks tended to think a little bit more creatively in regards to specifically casting. And again, because I was forcibly taught Shakespeare as early as kindergarten to lose my native language, I picked up the heightened language very easily, very quickly. And so that was my avenue into performance, is that I was able to get cast in these Shakespeare plays because I was a young person who understood um, the how to use that heightened language. And yeah, they could plug me into places, but not every place. Like never Juliet, always a nurse. um like never any of the young lovers, like random ensemble member number 6 or whatever it is. Anyway, so never in those capacities, so like it was still not the best. And again, that continued through undergraduate as well, is that the only opportunities I was given for like scene study to actually explore were Shakespeare, again because of my experience with the language, and also they just didn't know what pieces to give me because all they knew was the white American canon. And they're like, well, we also can't give you August Wilson. I'm like, no, you can't. So they're like, here you go. You can have this, and this is all you can have in the theater. Because again, they just didn't know what to do, and there were no opportunities for Native people, especially myself. Anyway, yeah, and so again, it's a very complicated relationship because like I have that like that softness because it was like my only segue into the theater that I was allowed for it, but also knowing the history of the system of Shakespeare as well as my own history. And once I like learned about Native playwrights and learned about the robust community of Native theater and made all these connections, like Shakespeare faded away. However, again, because of my background, I have theater companies who asked me like, hey, we want to do this Shakespeare play, but like, could you adapt it? And I was like, well, let's talk about it. And so in regards to Hamlet, that was my first, no, AO came first. AO is a funny story. Anyway, but with Hamlet, a theater company that specifically served Latino people wanted to produce it in their season. And yeah, they asked me to like to direct, and I was like, we need to adapt this. Like, I don't feel comfortable just like having brown people walking around pretending this is Denmark. Anyway, and so my relationship with Shakespeare now, and especially just with classics, is I'm very interested in how can we utilize the systems in place, and like not entirely flip it on its head. Like I'm very excited about Shakespeare in Paradise. I was like, oh, what is this? I'm very interested. But like use the system as like a tool of education and advocacy to undo the system. And so, for example, Hamlet becomes a very different story when it's set in pre-colonial Mexico within this indigenous community. And you have half of this indigenous community who've witnessed like the horrors Spain and England have done, and really want that power and are very interested in this colonial idea of power, juxtaposed to the indigenous folks of that same community who are like, no, this is not true to who we are. This is not what we want. Anyway, and Hamlet was just like a beautiful example of those clashings. And I was able to play with the language between the heightened Shakespearean language as well as like Spanish. I do know Spanish is a colonizer language. The cast could not grasp the indigenous language. It was okay. We looked past it anyway. But yeah, and it created a really interesting juxtaposition with like the ghost of Hamlet only speaking Spanish and only being like rooted in indigenous tradition, compared to Claudius, who's trying to be a European and run that way. And it also, again, spoiler, moral of the story, it doesn't end well because colonialism never ends well. Anyway, and so that was a really formidable experience for audiences because they never thought of Shakespeare as that kind of colonial system. They just thought of him as, again, like this pinnacle of the theatre, like this is what they go to. And so we were able to have like really robust, like after, like post-show discussions. It was also a really empowering experience for the cast, being fully Latino and indigenous. Is that like we were able to have these conversations around the system of Shakespeare, and they felt really empowered in the work that they were doing. Even the actors who were portraying folks like Claudius and Gertrude and Polonius, etc. But yeah, and then just how like that in my own journey, these adapting of classics have happened. It's all been the same thing. It's never been, ooh, I'm going to put Native people in a modern adaptation. Ooh, look at it. It's very much looking at that classical text. How does this uphold colonialism? And how can we make it a piece of advocacy and education? And so like Ao from Trojan Women moved on from an adaptation to become inspired as a new play entirely. Hamlet I still classify as an adaptation. Don Juan became its own play because it was able to critique machismo culture as well, in like in this time of the Me Too movement. For those familiar with the classical Don Juan story from 15, I forget when it was written. Anyway, very, very problematic story, not good. And yes, that's what I'm interested in. But I will say I don't advocate like actively pursue like Shakespeare opportunities. I don't like actively write like translation, like adaptations or new plays inspired by classical work. I now, because again, I wrote Hamlet and Ao and Don Juan a few years ago. And so I feel like where I am now, my artistic journey is very much about contemporary Native stories. Also like contemporary Native stories that aren't about colonialism, that aren't about trauma, that are about Native joy. I'm currently working on a Native rom-com. It's very funny. 1978, we had some good times. Anyway, like, so that's what I'm more interested in, but also understanding that like, when those opportunities do come, or when these theaters do arise, asking me like, oh, do you want to direct? Do you want to adapt, et cetera, et cetera? Having the conversation of like, how is colonialism present in the text? And what can we do to not colonize the actors through the process? Because again, as a former Shakespearean actress, that's what happened. I got colonized in these rehearsal rooms, and I ain't trying to replicate that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very complicated relationship.
Now, you specifically chose to set your Hamlet in a pre-colonial time period. And one of the things you were sharing with me earlier was, David, why is this called decolonizing Shakespeare? It should be called uncolonizing Shakespeare. Do you want to spell out those differences for us?
Yeah. So a really hopefully clear shorthand is so looking at, again, the word colonize, decolonize, these are all like coming from a colonized language, first and foremost. Anyway, but from what I was forcibly taught about English, when we have the prefix D, that like before like that verb, it implies like a returning to before colonization happened, right? Now, here's the thing, like for folks whose ancestry is rooted, especially in Europe, but in like colonizing countries, there is no before time of colonization. That's where colonization is indigenous too. So you can't go back to things that didn't exist. Now, whereas we have the word uncolonizing, and again, that prefix of undoing, of an action that was like done by the individual or by like the country, history, etc. Anyway, that is what especially like folks descended from Europe can do and other colonizing countries can do, because you can undo actions and systems that you've played into, that your ancestry has played into, that have built the foundation of the world that you live in. But you can't you can't decolonize that, because there's no frame of reference, there is no understanding, and there is no pre-colonization time for folks who originated colonization. So to say in short, if I may speak frankly,
Please do.
hey, in the United States, I'll be very specific, and Canada and other settler states across the world, white people cannot decolonize. It is impossible because of just that distinction right there. And so if organizations, if white people want to decolonize, like the indigenous people, Black people, people who have been colonized, have to lead those endeavors wholeheartedly, have to have sovereignty over that process of decolonization. White people can't lead it. They can't do it. They definitely can't do it alone, but they definitely cannot lead it. They can only uncolonize their own communities, selves, and systems.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah.
Nicolette, I see a lot of head nodding. Do you want to add on to anything that Tara?
No, I'm just going, wow. I really like that approach. Yeah, I mean, how do you decolonize the Caribbean? You can't bring those people and their cultures back to life. You just can't do it. You can't take the plantations that you can't put the trees back when you took them all down to plant cotton and to plant sugar. You can't do it. So I really like that distinction.
So Desh, you were very honest in communicating beforehand and saying that, I love you said, I feel like I should think of decolonizing in what I do, but I just see myself as a person that wants to explore these plays. Do you want to talk about the company you have founded recently, the Shakespeare Company of India, and how you see that as part of your journey as an artist and what you're trying to do with that?
Yeah. So as I said, that whenever I hear the discussion about the decolonizing or uncolonizing, I always think that I should be thinking about that. And I never do. So for me, it's all started with I had the privilege to not be forced into doing Shakespeare, because in my town, there were only one English medium school. So we all went to a school, which is, my mother tongue, Gujarati, was the medium of communication. So I studied English was just one of the subjects, like how different languages like science and math and environments, English was a subject. So I didn't speak English till I was like 20, 24, actually. I mean, I could read and write, and I hadn't heard of Shakespeare till I had heard the name, and I could probably say that he probably wrote Romeo and Juliet, but I couldn't be sure. So Shakespeare was nowhere in my life at all till I was 24. So I really had the privilege to not be colonized in any way. So I had no prejudice against him. He happened to be, my voice teacher happened to use Shakespeare monologue in my Linklater voice classes. And I couldn't read the play because I couldn't, it was hard. It was really hard to go through the play. I was falling asleep like several times because it's the first time I'm reading a verse. I'm like, why is it written this way? So and I was given, a speech, Edmund's speech from King Lear. I couldn't figure out what the hell I was saying. And I had to go up and do it in a class. And I was like, I went to Wikipedia and read something about it. And as I started to speak it, I had
You good, Desh? Oh, we've lost it. We're going to track down Desh. While we're waiting for Desh to get back in here, Nicolette and Terry, anything that you heard from each other about your own work that you wanted to bounce off?
Yeah, I was really interested in this, in the adaptation of Hamlet. And one day when we actually have some cash flow, you're going to hear from me, Tara, because yeah, because that sounds so cool. So what we did was we started with our very first play that we did in Shakespeare in Paradise. We opened with The Tempest, which is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. And I didn't know why it spoke to me until later, when I realized that he wrote it about Bermuda. He wrote it, and Bahamians are, the Bahamas was, the European settlement of the Bahamas was through Bermuda. So it was Bermudians coming to the Bahamas to settle. So that was one point of connection. And then you look at it, and Prospero is the British in the colonies, and Caliban is the Caribbean today. Caliban is the Caribbean person, and Ariel is those people, like Desh was saying, who were trying to please the colonial master because, you know, whatever. So Ariel's like the upper classes who were trying to assimilate. Caliban's like, you know, can I curse? Can I cuss on this? Can I use?
Sure.
Okay, great. He's like, fuck you. I can just curse you. You made me talk beautifully, and I use it to like just say fuck you, right? And yeah, I'm like, this is the play, but it's also the play that Caribbean scholars have used to talk about the colonial, because we have been so, in order to become a scholar, you had to go through the passage of Shakespeare. So we decided to hit the ground running with The Tempest, even though nobody really knew what The Tempest was about, but it was about a hurricane. So we recognized that. So we figured we could riff off of that. So it was good.
Welcome back, Desh.
Hi, is my sound okay?
Yeah, your sound is good. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I think where I left off was that, so the long story short, as I spoke the language, I discovered how good the poetry is. And so I fell in love with the language. And so for me, that was the connection between me as an actor to Shakespeare as the writer. That was the only relationship that I knew. And then I got to know more and more about the plays. I started to realize that Elizabethan society is so much like the Indian society. And I'm like, man, I should stage these back home. I mean, they would feel like these are written for them, because from day one, I felt, even today when I read the play, I instantaneously feel like it's written for me. Like he wants me to do this. Like he wants me to play this part. He wants me to stage this play. And this new generation of India is, there's a strong current of individuality coming into practice. My parents lived in a very community-based country in India, where the roles were already decided before you were born. If you were the eldest, if you were the youngest, if you were the son or the daughter or the uncle, your so much is already decided. And we have hierarchy as well. So just like Elizabethan society, and now there are individuals who are rebelling, and I'm one. Even for pursuing theater, I'm one. I'm the only person. I'm the first in my family to not go for a regular job. So and to do, forget doing theater, just so. And I'm like, and Shakespeare plays, they have this society, so Elizabethan society. There is a code, there is a hierarchy, and then there are these strong individual characters who go against the society, and they question whether I want to play the part or I want to carve out my own path. And I'm like, oh man, I got to do this. I got to do this in India. And so that's been the reason behind Shakespeare Company of India. And I genuinely see King Lear is a classic story of so many Indian parents who once they give it over to the kids do not take care of the parents. Of course, there's not an exact story, but there's so many relatable themes, like arranged marriages. I mean, Romeo and Juliet is most popular play because even today, if you marry outside your caste, you will be killed. That happens today. That's not like, that's not 400 or even like 40 years ago. That happens today. I can find news articles today that's like, boom, that's Romeo and Juliet. Oh, boom, mob lynching, the scene from Julius Caesar. I mean, man, I could do that, and I could have like Indian actors speak Shakespearean text, but I still feel that it'll still cut through in a very relatable way. Like they will feel that these are our stories. So as long as that factor is working for me, um, I haven't been really I haven't asked the question about. I do have to decolonize and uncolonize the hell out of the actors because they come in colonized already. The audience isn't, because we don't do Shakespeare so much in India. Like nobody cares about Shakespeare. It's just like I'm the only person in Mumbai doing Shakespeare in his original text. So, and nobody knows the plays, Even if I change it upside down, they wouldn't know whether it is me or if that's how the play is. And I wonder, so they don't know. So, but the actors come in thinking that this is a period writing, British, Victorian. So we associate in Shakespeare not as Elizabethan, but as a Victorian writer, because it was Queen Victoria under whose governance Shakespeare was brought to India. And I'm guessing, I don't know how it, I don't know why that people felt that it has to be stylized. It's not just British. I mean, that's there for sure, that they want to sound British when they do Shakespeare, but it's also stylized. There's a lot of sawing the air with hands too much. So I do have to uncolonize or decolonize or destylize, and that process is there for the actors. Like, no, these are our stories, that's you and me. That's our life right there. Like that happens in our homes, in our society, in our politics. So we're doing that play. So that's hard in a way, because this play is not written by an Indian writer with names are, Julius Caesar, not an Indian name. So that's the tricky part.
Yeah, and I know one thing.
Answer the question.
Yeah, and one thing you shared
Yeah.
earlier with me is that you, and I think this connects to that idea of you were talking about that you have when you start rehearsals with your actors, you have them work on the text in their whatever their native language is in India.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit more about that process and why?
Yeah, yes. So the initial process is that we talk about the themes, and then we share our own life examples connected to the theme. So right away, I want to make it clear that this is about us and not somebody from a different country and different time period. And then we right away start using our own language. And that does pretty much everything that I needed it to do. And also, especially the rituals, we make a point of improvising those rituals in our ways. For example, if we're doing, so we did Hamlet last, like a digital production. So we lived through the funeral of King Hamlet, but we did it in an Indian way, like because we burn the bodies. We don't bury the body, So we have our own ritual. So we do it that way. So it becomes more about our story. So we constantly keep putting our ingredients, and we keep dressing it up in our own ways. And I make a case that that's what the writer wants us to do, whether it is true or not. But I just do it. I approach it that way, that he wants our truth. He doesn't want, you know, he's counting on us as actors to bring our truth and our understanding, and the text will just work. The text will do he will do his thing, and we got to do our thing. So it will not work if we are not true to ourselves.
So
I think that's what I think is the problem with the system of Shakespeare. Because like you were talking about like how much you identified with like the story and the themes and how it was like very authentic and like of like your community. But the problem with the system of Shakespeare is that it becomes it is a tool of colonization, and there's no room for yeah, I identify with this play, great, I'm going to do it. Oh, these other people don't identify with this play, cool, it's not that big of a deal. Instead, it's this oppressive structure of, if you want to do theater, you have to, like, Shakespeare has to be at the center of this. Like, it has to be the center of your education, like the center of this talk about like classical theater or foundational theater anyway. And like, if we're able to dismantle that system, it allows folks like both you, Desh, and me to thrive within it. Because like comparatively, my communities, we don't have that hierarchical structure. We don't have a caste system. We've never had this idea of like the bourgeoisie or royalty. And so there have been no points of connection to the stories in general. I would love to talk to you, Nicolette, about the Tempest all day long because lots of thoughts. Anyway, but because of the system of Shakespeare, it doesn't allow both of us to thrive. It says we both have to do it. We all have to do it or else. And yeah, and that's just like, oh, that's just
But
a
it's so
sticky.
fascinating. Yeah, but it's so fascinating because I'm facing the opposite issue. The opposite issue is that, so we don't have the Shakespeare as the epitome of theater and classic theater because nobody does Shakespeare in India. And even if Shakespeare is done, it's adapted, translated so much that like people don't even know that it's Shakespeare. Like if I tell them like, oh, do you know this film, this Bollywood film is actually the Shakespeare play, they'll be like, oh, really? So they don't really care. So I face the opposite issue because in India, and especially also the current government, they change the tone, like how Trump's America is some kind of like Trump's America, like there's some kind of rhetoric that gets talked about. So I think the government does something. So we have a current government who is a very pro-Hindu government, and they want to really use that card, and they want to make India a Hindu nation. So they're playing that card constantly, which is about anti-Islam strategy, rhetoric, and also just anti-Western rhetoric, and it doesn't sound right the way they're doing it. On paper it's like, oh yeah, like let's talk about us, like we as Indians. But I know that this rhetoric is political and not for actual change and actual growth and evolution, but it's a religious advantage that they want to have. And in these times in India, there is even more scrutiny. So nobody has read Shakespeare apart from like tiny group of people who's pursuing masters with English as language or literature. Nobody has read Shakespeare, and they hate him. But I get so many people to say, well, why Shakespeare? And why not Indian writers? And I'm like, well, I'm the only one doing Shakespeare, so I don't think the Indian writers are in danger. you know, uh, I mean, and I'm not taking over any time. So so they're not really worried about like what the question you have, like how Shakespeare just becomes the face of classical theater. In India, that's not the case, but there's this hatred towards Shakespeare because of our colonial history, and they have not read Shakespeare. They don't even know what's inside the plays. So I'm like, but you're missing out. You're missing out on good poetry. That's what I tell my other friends, because I meet hardcore people who are like not into Shakespeare, do not want to do him, is anti-India action. And to be really honest, I give them like, okay, well, you hate him. Why don't you just read this prologue of Henry V, which I don't even think is like it's like the best. It's not like Macbeth's or Hamlet's soliloquies. And I'm like, just read it. And the body always responds. I've seen it in every case. English speakers or not, whether they like or not, whether they know him, do not like him or love him, male, female, young, or they always enjoy speaking the text. So I'm facing the opposite question. I'm like, you guys, you haven't read him, you don't know him at all. You probably couldn't even spell his name right, and you're against him.
It's the different side of the same coin, because the same coin is colonization, and that's just another byproduct of the colonization, is the extreme projection of anything that can stem out of Europe, like understandably so. And so that's why like liberation benefits everyone, like decolonization benefits everyone, because it allows like that room for like interpretation to bring in and like do and explore other works, as well as explore like works of our home communities at the same time, because there isn't this like rigid structure of colonization in place that's looming over people. I mean, it's the same thing in my communities with theater as in general. They view it as a colonized art form. I mean, and that's why, like, there was a question about foundational Native playwrights. Those plays are from the 1960s, 1970s. I don't know of anything earlier than that, because again, theater was like, there's just so much hate from the Native community towards theater, like even now, because of the same thing. It's a like a mix of a trauma response to the colonization that like manifests within the theater and the classism and the elitism and all the things, as well as that like that feeling as though like theater is so radically different from how we tell stories, and that's something that comes strictly from Europe. So like, why would we even bother? But again, at the same time, the answer is the same. The answer is decolonization, because it benefits literally everyone. Anyway.
So I guess, I mean,
we have, sure, go ahead, Nicolette.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, both of you, it's ringing bells. Like for us, the vast majority of people, so our population is, I'd say 2/3 under the age of 45, and then everybody else is older. If you're older, we got independence in 1973. So if you're older, you are steeped. You studied Shakespeare, right? And what was really interesting, what we do is we try to get away from all of the preconceptions that we came to Shakespeare with, the kinds of stuff that, like, I was killing myself laughing when you said you have to decolonize the actors. Luckily for us, most of our actors are too young to have been exposed that much to Shakespeare, so we don't have to decolonize them, but we have to decolonize our audiences, right? Because the people who are coming to see Shakespeare are coming to see Shakespeare, right? And, we're not wandering around prancing about in doublets and speaking with, English accents. And what we also do, the first Shakespeare play that we did was Macbeth, and we did away with the king. We turned it into an election war. Basically, Duncan was the prime minister, Macbeth was the chairman of the party, and so we did that. And we keep doing that kind of radical reimagining. And for the one that I think hit home the most, it wasn't our best production by any means. I was really not happy with the production, but the adaptation worked. We did a merchant, not of Venice, because we are not in Venice, and we didn't say the Merchant of Nassau, we just called it Merchant. And we turned Shylock into a Haitian immigrant, not even a Haitian immigrant. He wasn't an immigrant, he was the son of an immigrant. And in the Bahamas, we have our own issues in terms of the kinds of things that you're talking about, Desh. We are very, very insular, and we have a large Haitian migrant worker population, and they are very much downtrodden. And so by putting Shylock in that position and having him play and having the end be, because there's this sense of send all Haitians back to Haiti, right? And by Haitian, we mean people whose grandparents were immigrants, because I have an actor whose grandparents came. He has never been, he may have been to Haiti, but he is Bahamian. His parents were born in the Bahamas. He was born in the Bahamas, and he has to apply for a Bahamian passport at the age of 18 because he is defined as a non-Bahamian. Okay, that is how deep it goes. And so we had Shylock playing one of those kinds of what would in other countries be called first or second generation immigrants. And his punishment at the end is to be sent back, is deported, to be sent back to Haiti. And the response we got from our school audience, I understand, on a bus going home, was this boy was almost in tears. He was like, that's not fair. He's never even been to Haiti. He can't even speak Creole. And they sent him back to Haiti. But this is a reality for people of Haitian descent in the Bahamas. So to have that play strike that kind of chord, it tells me something about the power of what we're doing. And the other thing that happened was, when we did Julius Caesar, we did it again with election. We did it in an election year, and Julius Caesar, it was an election fight again. And that was the one time we sold out the theater. We have a 330-seat theater. It was sold out several nights. And the people who came were reciting Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar is probably the most studied play, followed by Macbeth, in the Bahamas. And we had people just saying the words along with us. And that was like, it's never happened again. There's only one Julius Caesar. But that was incredible.
Well, I want to work in some of the questions that we've been getting in our Q&A here. And there's one here that about, I'm curious to hear from these artists about what they do find inspiring, curious, or interesting about the works. And I think Desh started talking about, the body always responds, to it. And Nicolette, you were just speaking, very eloquently about how your audience responded to some of these works. But the kind of question here is, why, if Shakespeare does have this legacy of colonialism in your country, this harmful legacy of colonialism, why bother? Why not just leave them aside and do other works? Is there, this person framed the question here, is there joy, stimulation in the language or the stories? So how would anybody answer that?
I love the language. We all have to obviously do the decolonizing or uncolonizing, but those who love the language, I think, we also have the responsibility to separate the man from the system and do the plays if we love the plays. Because for me, the way I see it is that I don't think any actor or director would ever say only Shakespeare, right? I mean, we love so many modern writers, and we have Indian writers, who I love, and other writers. But for me, Shakespeare is, because we're moving so far from the efficient use of language, and there is this guy whose characters use language in this magical, efficient, convincing way. And he wrote like 38 of these. So it's hard to ignore. And so the question for me is like, why wouldn't I do that? It's so good. The writing is just so good for me. I love the writing. So I'm willing to take on other challenges that come with him. And I worked through it because I think the language is, for me, it's worth it.
So I guess for me, one of the things, like, there's all kinds of things at play, and it's a very conflicted relationship. As a student of literature, I have that same connection with the language, but I'm not sure that our actors have the same response. They have so much work to do to stop being scared and to stop feeling that they can't, right? So we have to do a lot of work with that. And we've done a number of different things. Like when my husband is directing a Shakespeare play, and I'm sure that there are people in your audience who are going to have to be revived after I say this. but he takes out all of the line breaks. He turns it all into prose, right? He decides that I'm not gonna mess them up. I'm just gonna let them see it as words rather than verse, because we do have some people who are like sort of like doing the prancing and the whatever. So he just takes away all of the line breaks. As a poet, I don't always go with that, but he's a brilliant director. It seems to work. But for me, what is really important are two things. One is Shakespeare's, it's not just the language that is heightened, it's also the action that's heightened. Modern writers don't always go there, right? Like he will go there. You got bodies on bodies on bodies on bodies when you have a tragedy, or the total lunacy. Like he just goes all the way, right? And if you do it right, it is healing. I'm looking for that kind of catharsis. We have a very damaged society. The damage that was done by the genocide and the enslavement and the forced labor and the cruelty that made our region has made our region the country, the place in the world that has the highest interpersonal violence anywhere in the world except for war zones. Like what is normative to us, our normal response to stuff is violent. And you can't necessarily heal that only with the tools of the therapist, right? You need some of the more ancient tools, and theater was one of those tools. So that's part of what's going on with me and why we do it.
I'm feeling a little salty today. So I feel like the answer will change day to day. The answer, like for me today, is I'm not interested. As of today, not interested. Don't ask me. Not interested. But the reason why at this point in time is because the theater in the United States is still so inherently colonial. There is not a single like major institution that is ready to have an truly like decolonial process with a Shakespeare play. And I've learned that the hard way in my career so thus far. And so that is what's currently fueling my answer of no, bitch, I'm not into it. Now, when that time comes, it is coming, y'all, but when that time comes where the theater is able to break up its foundation of settler colonialism and build anew, that is when I will be interested. Because currently as it stands is that there's not the institutional framework to support that type of deeply nuanced work that Shakespeare needs in this settler colonial society that we live in to be empowering and a positive experience for Indigenous people in the room. That's not to say that that time's not coming, because it is. That's not to say, like with the production of Hamlet, that theater company was ready. And I also now run that theater company. Anyway, it's all a little different now. Anyway, yes, that's not to say that those opportunities have not existed before, but on a wide, like on a mainstream scale, it doesn't. And so I currently cannot in good faith bring myself and any other Native collaborator into a predominantly white institution that hasn't done deep decolonial work to work on such a like deeply colonial and nuanced system of Shakespeare. Can't do it. A very strong moral code and I can't do it. But that's where I'm at today. And I'm really hopeful for tomorrow. And like, what is the work that institutions can do to not uphold that system that will allow for these other interpretations and for this like deeply enriching work. Because again, I think the process of Hamlet was such an enriching process that I have never been able to find since, and I could not find before, because it was that rare. But when I feel confident enough, like y'all call me, but only then.
And I want to point out that again that Tara runs a consulting organization called Groundwater Arts, and we have a shout out in our question and answer here from somebody who has taken 2 of Groundwater Arts workshops, and they were incredibly illuminating. So if you want to help American theater do the work to where Tara might be interested in doing Shakespeare again, look up Groundwater Arts they're happy to be of service with that. There was another question, and a question, then a kind of follow up about class and Shakespeare, and how that manifests itself in each of your communities. Does that resonate with anyone? The questions of class and Shakespeare, and how it connects to some of the things we've been talking about today.
Oh yeah, totally. And then of course in the Caribbean, class intersects with race, and so yeah, so it's definitely a class thing. The people who came to see Julius Caesar and were sitting in the audience speaking it are the political classes. They're the political classes of the country. They took their education and they became the leaders. And so we had more politicians in that audience and more failed politicians in that audience. So there's absolutely a class thing. Shakespeare is for the upper classes, and that's definitely at work. And then it intersects, as I said, with race as well.
Deshik, that seemed like it resonated with you as well.
Yeah. Sorry, could you? I don't know if I got the question right. Is the class thing is in what reference?
Just how how class fits into some of these issues with Shakespeare, and there was a specific gentleman wrote that growing up poor and white in America, there was a sense that you were too stupid to get Shakespeare, and just whether that kind of class issue resonates with how Shakespeare is seen in your communities.
I mean, so as I said earlier, like Shakespeare doesn't come up a lot in everyday life here. It might be like the issues that I'm hearing from Nicolette and Tara is they're probably going to happen in future, because now the new generation is all English medium schools, and they do have Shakespeare in their curriculum, and they all hate it, rightfully so, because I mean, no offense, but it's mostly taught by teachers, and teachers, it's a play, so they're meant to be done, and performed. It's like teaching football in a class. So kids don't like it. So it might be a few problem in future, but at present Shakespeare doesn't come up. But yes, there is that thing of like my friends would joke that, oh, he talks in Shakespearean, he quotes Shakespeare and we won't know what that is. But they don't really play that kind of a part. Yeah, it might be the pitfall in future though.
Yeah, I mean, it's all interconnected, especially. I mean, speaking for my own specific community, I mean, theater themselves, they call it a white man's art form. Anyway, but with theater, not only is it like, does it hold that elitism, which is directly related to class, but in specifically how it intersects with race is if where I'm from, if you're a Black, brown, or Indigenous person and you're doing Shakespeare, the question people ask is, why are you trying to be white? It's always felt as though it's been something that has been reserved for white folks and white folks only. And so, like, why are you trying to assimilate are the questions. And so again, that's an additional barrier on top of it all that adds to the very complicated and nuanced system of Shakespeare. And like every colleague who is not white that I've ever spoken to about Shakespeare has all said the same thing. Especially when I was working at the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C., speaking with the staff of color, it was all the same thing is, oh yeah, I talked to my mom back home today. She has no idea why I'm here. No one has any idea what I'm doing here, why I'm doing this. Why am I trying to talk white, act white, look white, or whatever it may be. Anyway, and so like, I personally would argue in my specific community, it's that element of race and colonization is more the forefront of the mind than classes, but also class is a deeply racialized issue. So it's baked in.
So there are, I mean, so many detailed questions in our Q&A, and there's no way we're going to be able to get to them. So I kind of want to give a closing question here that kind of wraps in two of these in some way. And there's this question of, as we talk about the colonial system and how Shakespeare has been used by that system, there was a question of, well, does that really connect to what Shakespeare himself was trying to do? Shakespeare, how do we know what Shakespeare the artist was trying to do? And the answer is we don't, right? We don't know what Shakespeare the artist was trying to do, but we do know that Shakespeare was a part of this colonial worldview in his country that he was living and writing in. So I guess the last question I would try to pull from a couple of these is there a way that we can just wrestle, and not just, but is there a way that we can, what is a step that we can take to be able to dive in and unlock Shakespeare the writer, and I don't know, Shakespeare the system? That's a huge question. No way to really answer that, but does anybody, as a kind of closing thought from each of you, a way to unlock Shakespeare the writer?
I would say the production has to be good. If the truth and the poetry comes out, that's when they can meet the writer. But if they watch the play, they don't know what's going on. They're just going to hate him more, because I think it's a bigger torture to sit through a bad Shakespeare play compared to a bad, like a contemporary play, when you can still follow what's going on, and here is just words. So I think like a good direction and the acting, suiting the action to the word and the word to the action, that needs to be good.
Thanks, Deshik.
I just typed an answer. I think, yeah, if we're talking about Shakespeare the artist, Shakespeare the man, from what I know about Shakespeare the artist and Shakespeare the man, he was a very, very pragmatic person. He was definitely linked with the political elites of his time. He was writing for my thing, what I responded was, it's just a good thing he died when he died, because he died before the whole colonial project really got off the ground and got really, really mean and bad and horrible. It was just at the very beginning. And so maybe he gets a pass. I can't say that from what I've read about him that he would have not had those intentions. However, I think that a lot of what Desh says is true. I think that his art was of a kind that it went beyond the man, right? And there's truth and there's beauty in what he left behind, and that is salvageable. So, nobody is separate. Nobody is better than what their community is doing, right? And not, especially if you're not a political, pragmatic businessman who also happens to write amazing plays, you're going to be implicated.
I think from my own perspective, unfortunately, there is no way to separate the playwright from the system at this point. In my own humble opinion, whenever I hear these kinds of questions, it reads very gaslighting to me, because it's, oh, well, we want to prioritize the art. It's not about the system. While just trying to delegitimize the entire truth around the system and how he as an artist has been weaponized within it. Like, we can't go back. Sorry about you. Like, we can't separate those things, first and foremost. And then also additionally, what we can't forget about too is that even though I agree with some of these hypotheses that Shakespeare wasn't out here to colonize the world with his works, I agree with that. I agree with that. I didn't think, I think he'd have some opinions, and I'm yeah, I agree with these things. However, the society that he lived in, a strict hierarchical society that had a very long history of colonizing one another, as well as colonizing the world, and also like the colonization of the quote unquote new world of the Americas began 70 years prior. And also like the same time, they were colonizing the Irish, literally the same time Shakespeare was alive and has been. That is the water he swam in. That is the world he lived in. Those are the kinds of ideas and just societal norms that informed how he was raised, how every single person was raised. And so with that, it like, you can't separate him as the artist and playwright from this system that was then created, because he lived within the exact same system. It's just that system has then just been exacerbated in the time since globally. And so when I think of like, what is a tactical, like practical step to move towards undoing, like to get to the point where we can appreciate Shakespeare as an artist, because I think like that's the point, that's the goal. Because then again, that allows all of us to thrive, to do his works unabashedly, to find these connections and really resonate with his work. Because again, like the language is beautiful. Like these are plays that are like very exciting. But before we can get to that point, we have to undo the system first. Like, I'm sorry, you can't do it at the same time, my humble opinion. You can't try to separate it because they're so deeply, deeply intertwined. And so like a practical first step, number one, is decolonize your shit. All of it. What are you doing within your theater? Is your institution actually able to allow artists to practice their creative sovereignty? Spoiler, I doubt it. If you live in a settler state. Anyway, like, do you actually have like the stewarded environment to create, like, to not like uphold this system of Shakespeare? And again, I can guarantee you 98% of the theaters in the United States, at least, the answer is no, they don't have those things yet. So do that work of decolonization and anti-racism first and now. And then also, spoiler, that work is never done. It's a lifelong thing. We continue to do it anyway. But when it's progressed far enough where those environments are being stewarded and created, then like, in my humble opinion, like that's the time where we can start to be like, okay, is this a comfortable space where we can talk about like Shakespeare the artist and just the plays themselves separate from the system? Are we almost there? Let's try it and let's see. But it's like an ongoing thing. So again, step one, literally step one, is understand the difference between decolonization and anti-racism versus equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because spoiler, they're not the same thing. Anyway, and they don't do the same things. One upholds systems, one doesn't. You can pick which one. You can figure it out. Anyway, do the work first. And then we can have a better, more just future that empowers every single person, not just Indigenous people, not just people of color, but literally benefits every single person, even those who are descended from colonizers.
I slightly disagree about this. I slightly disagree about this because I feel that as this is important, the decolonizing, without which I think the future is impossible to grow forward. I absolutely agree with that part, but I believe that the writing, the depth is still there so much that I don't feel that Shakespeare is just a guy from that time. If that was the case, I don't think that the writing would have transcended so many centuries and so many cultures and language barriers. I think the beauty is so strong existing that the both things need to happen together as we try and decolonize our society. But the writer is equally strong, and I would argue that it's as strong as the other who has taken disadvantage of, has branded Shakespeare for colonizing. I think the writing is equally strong for the actors to do it for that purpose. So I think both need to happen. There is no, I think we're all on the good side. So people who are for decolonizing, they need to work as much, and we all need to contribute to that. But those who love it for the writing, and they believe that the writing has the beauty and truth enough, that exploration also needs to happen. I disagree that Shakespeare's just like, he is not separate from the system. I don't think I would have fallen in love with him, and I see Indians falling in love with him through me, like every day.
Nicolette, any the last thought from you?
Well, I was going to say that's the paradox, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I don't know. I mean, I don't, what do I want to say? For me, the pragmatics, there's, how can I put this? If Shakespeare could be weaponized against me, I can take that weapon and turn it around. Like the whole thing about Audre Lorde and the master's tools dismantling the master's house. Maybe not, but the master's sword can fight the battle, right? So that's the way I look at it. But remember, we're all in different spaces. We're all in a different location, right? I'm in an independent country that began the process of political decolonization and took on a lot of trappings. But the other thing I wanted to say is, one thing that we all need to understand that I don't think maybe we talk enough about, but I know it from living it daily. We were decolonized politically almost 50 years ago, but we continually recolonize ourselves because we don't do the work that we have to do as a nation of predominantly people of African descent and mixed African descent, to reclaim our own dignity from out of that history. And I see that performing Shakespeare is part of that reclamation for us. But we always have to recognize that we have perpetuated our own colonization because we internalize all of those things. And I'm sure, Tara, you know what that is, right? You internalize all those things that people told you about yourself, and then you reaffirm them on your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, and it just keeps going.
Well, Tara, Nicolette, Desh, thank you so much for wrestling with these topics tonight, for sharing your truths. Each of you said some words towards the end that just jumped out to me. And Tara talked about the goals that allow everyone to thrive and to be unabashed in what they're doing. And it's only when we can set up those situations where people can thrive and be unabashed that we can reach the heightened action that Nicolette talked about with Shakespeare, that brings the healing and the catharsis. And then when we have that healing catharsis, then we get to the place where the body responds to the text, as Desh was saying. This is an incredibly complicated process. Delaware Shakespeare is tiptoeing, trying to do the work. And I thank you for everything that I learned tonight listening to all of you. And again, thank you for joining us from wherever across this globe you are today. Thank you so much for your time. Again, for our listeners out there, this is a Pay What You Decide event. So when this ends, you're going to get an email from Delaware Shakespeare inviting you to pay whatever you decide. This conversation was worth to you tonight. Desh, Nicolette, Tara, thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, because this is rare. Nobody ever asks what we bring to the table. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Good night, all.
Good night.